So, what do you got for me? I'm sure you were up all night thinking about answers to our questions. Should we remind ourselves? Let's just go back over the Rashi very quickly, and we'll remind ourselves exactly what the issues were, and we'll see if we have any answers. This is where science turns into art. What's so beautiful and powerful about this process in Rashi? That's not a. These are all in Hebrew, totally in Hebrew. I have 5 copies. If anybody, yeah.
A group of us got held up, and most people are almost here.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Fine. So what you'll notice is that Rashi always begins as a technician and then ends as an artist. When I say that, what I mean is that his questions are very, very technical questions in the text. There's something grammatically off. There's something contextually off. This doesn't fit here. But the answers very often are going to be explosively, phenomenally beautiful answers that have the ability to change our lives. So step 4 is really where we get creative and where we get to explore the deeper nature of Rashi. So we started with a question. Rashi's question, who's channeling Rabbi Yitzchak before him, who says the Torah should not have begun here. Good morning, Roy. Afternoon. Oh, wow. Mazel tov. Thank you. The Torah shouldn't have begun here. The Torah should have started at the first mitzvah. Hello, Lewis.
Yes. Sorry, okay.
No problem. Should have begun with the first mitzvah, which is way into the towards the beginning of the second book of the Torah. So what is all of this doing here? Creation story, the Garden of Eden, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, descent into Egypt. What's it doing here? His answer is, well, the reason why we need all of this introduction is to teach us that if the non-Jews ever come to us and tell us that we are thieves and that we've stolen the land of Israel from the 7 nations that were occupying the land before us, we know what to tell them. We can say, look, it says in our book that God created the world. And creation necessitates ownership. When you've created something, it means you're the owner of it. Isn't that the foundation of Marxism? Something like that? You own your labor, right? Isn't that the idea?
And then they have a follow-up question.
Well, hold on.
Whoa.
We're still in Rashi. Before we get to the questions on Rashi, let's just remind ourselves what the Rashi is. Rashi says God created it, and therefore He owns it, and therefore He can decide who to give it to. He gave it to them, He took it away from them, and He gave it to us. Now we had 3 questions. Who remembers what the first question was?
In the order?
Yeah, well, just going through the Rashi, it's in kind of chronological order of if you were to read the Rashi. What's the first question that we would have on Rashi? Yes, Joey?
Why did Rashi assume that Torah is a book of mitzvahs?
Why does Rashi assume that the Torah's primary aim is to give us mitzvahs? Maybe it's a history book. Maybe it's a story book. Maybe it's to teach us about the creation and about Adam and Eve and all of those good things that actually exist in the Torah. Why? How does he know that the Torah is supposed to be a book of mitzvahs? Question number 2. Ben?
Who would accept this argument?
Okay, that's great. That's question number 3. Is that if seemingly the reason why we're going through the whole first book of the Torah is to know what to say to non-Jews who tell us that we're thieves, are the non-Jews who don't subscribe to the Torah going to accept this as a legitimate piece of evidence that we do have a rightful claim to the land? It's kind of ridiculous. It's like if anybody ever watched, there's a couple rabbis out there, Rabbi Tovia Singer and others, who have debates with missionaries, right? There's a lot of Jews for Jesus out there who are trying to convert Jews to their brand of Messianic Judaism, which is not a legitimate, what we understand to be a legitimate form of Judaism. And one of the ground rules that they lay whenever they have these debates is, I can't use any piece of information that you don't accept. So a Christian can't use the New Testament as as evidence that Jesus is the Messiah because I don't accept the New Testament. Now, conversely, a Jew couldn't use the Talmud as evidence to try to prove to you that Jesus was not the Messiah because you don't accept the legitimacy, the authority of the Talmud. So for us to say that we're going to use the Chumash, the Torah, to try to prove to a non-Jew who doesn't accept the legitimacy of the Torah, that's pretty ridiculous. Okay, so that's question 3. Now what's the middle question? Aaron?
Was it why it starts off with the beginning, or was there a question on the other round?
That was Rashi's question.
That was how one of the ways that we understood Rashi's question. In other words, what's the textual question is in the beginning. I know this is the beginning. This is the first word of the book. You don't need to tell me we are now starting the book. Yeah, Roy.
Wasn't it a criticism that, he says in the beginning, the reason that we don't start with mitzvahs is because we want to use it as a proof that why Israel belongs to us? Isn't that incongruent?
It's incongruent. In other words, Rashi doesn't seem to come down from his assumption that the book is a book of mitzvahs. He doesn't say, it's not really a book of mitzvahs. He never says that. So if we're keeping with that assumption that the book is a book of mitzvahs, then I would expect the introduction to be something that is necessary for understanding all the mitzvahs. But that's not what it sounds like. It sounds like this is a side point, which is, by the way, you live in the land of Israel and people have claims against you about your right to that land. But what does that have to do with mitzvahs? This is an introduction to a book of mitzvahs. That's the third question. I would add one more question. I was going through this again last night, and I think there's something worth pointing out here as well, which is it possible, let's assume Rashi's correct, that this is the reason why the whole first book of the Torah is here, is to prove that we have a legitimate claim to the land of Israel. Wait a minute, you're telling me that the entire explosive story of the 6 days of creation, the story of the Garden of Eden, which is as we'll hopefully soon see, is the most fundamental story of humankind ever written, which describes the entire human condition. All of the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs and what it means to be a righteous human being that we learn from them, all of those things are only in order to prove that we have a right to the land of Israel. They're not to teach us the deepest fundamentals of faith and what it means to be a righteous human being. That seems a little bit over the top, don't you think? Taking all of those fantastic stories and saying, yeah, I mentioned all of that to you just to prove to you that this document here, this Balfour Declaration, is actually well-founded. So I think that's another question that we can add on. Yeah, does everyone understand that question?
So is it so much different from question 2?
I think it's slightly different from question 2. Question 2 is, what does this claim to the land of Israel have to do with mitzvahs? Right? But on top of that, it's like, wow, that's a lot to go through just to prove to me that we have a right to the land of Israel. Meaning, even if you'll tell me that it is worthwhile, very worthwhile, to spend all of that ink talking about how we have a legitimate claim to the land of Israel, that's fantastic. But did you have to go through all these phenomenal stories just to prove that? Yeah, Eli?
Yeah, so I got a question yesterday, right? So even if we would say, okay, it is just a book of mitzvahs, let's put it this way, and it's a code of law, even then, why does it say, okay, it should start in Shemot instead of Bereshit? Because the very first mitzvah is already written in the parasha Bereshit.
Great question. So I think, Ben, I think you asked this question yesterday? Somebody over here, maybe it was Austin. Austin, you said, excuse me, these are not the first mitzvahs. Yes. We've got one mitzvah in Genesis. You know what mitzvah it is?
Be fruitful.
Be fruitful and multiply. We have a mitzvah that we learn from Abraham. You know what that is? Bris Milah, circumcision. We have a mitzvah that we learn from Jacob. It's a very specific mitzvah, which is that one may not eat the gid hanashe, the tendon. I can't remember what the tendon is called. Particular ligament, the sciatic nerve. Thank you, Joey. The sciatic nerve that's usually found in filet mignon, unfortunately. So there are other mitzvahs that we do learn from Genesis. So the answer to that, Eli, is that that is the first mitzvah that's commanded to the Jewish people as a whole. That's where we should begin. We are the Jewish people in our instantiation. And that's where our story should begin, with the first commandment to us as a whole. Okay, let's start from the beginning. How does Rashi know that this is a book of mitzvahs? Who's got an answer? Azrael. These are, guys, you're allowed to be wrong. That's the first thing. Let me just, before you start, okay? Rule number one, you're allowed to be wrong. We're offering our own inner opinions here. This is a free-flowing exchange of ideas. The way that we improve and the way that we get better is by throwing out an idea, and someone says, "Okay, that's interesting. I have a question on that. Maybe there's something flawed with that reasoning. Can we come up with a better answer?" That's how we develop here. So there's no such thing as throwing out something that's a waste of time, unless somebody's already said it. The second thing I want to just say is, it's entirely possible that although I've studied this, and I've studied many of the answers of the thousands of years of rabbinic sages that have been speaking about this Rashi, it is entirely possible that one of you has an answer that I have never seen before, and can be a very good answer. So, just want to put that out there. Okay, Azrael.
So, we see partially from the structure, and actually from the different parsha, see like the beginning, the creation of the earth entirely described in like 12 sentences, maybe even less. However, like the Mishkan and the performing of the mitzvahs described like in entire sections. So, given we say that the Torah is like ideal book, so it's not written by people but by God, we cannot say this is a storybook, because we see the priority was not on the story itself, but on the mitzvahs.
Okay, Azrael, great. Bringing proof from the text. The evidence of the text is that the overwhelming majority of verses in the Torah is spent discussing mitzvahs. So that's a pretty good answer, right? Now, that's only marginally true. In other words, you have certainly the first entire book of the Torah, which is dedicated to stories. At least half of the second book dedicated to stories, and then throughout there's a good amount of stories in the fourth book, right? And some amount spent in the fifth book, and the third book is a little bit light on stories, but there's also some stories there as well. So you end up with about 60, 65, maybe 70% of the book dealing with mitzvahs. So that's entirely possible that maybe simply because of the fact that we spend more time on mitzvahs, that's how we know the book is about mitzvahs. Anyone have a response that they'd like to offer to Azrael? Agree, disagree? It's more interesting if you disagree. Nate?
So I think a lot of times with the stories too, there's mitzvahs woven in. It might not be as directly obvious, but I think it's definitely there.
Okay, great. So there are certainly a lot of mitzvahs, and even if they're not mitzvahs, they're customs. They are ways of behaving. We learn about what kindness is from Abraham and from Rebecca. We learn what it means to be a great human being from these stories, and those might be just as important in terms of our conduct and our behavior as the mitzvahs themselves. So yeah, that could be a nice response to Azrael. Anyone else? Yeah, Miles.
I also kind of think about it as kind of like a guide for how you should live or how to live. It's called a Torah observant life.
Right.
Kind of like he said, like mitzvahs are like woven into the stories, and even if it's not like directly do this, don't do this. There's just lessons to be learned from
Sure.
the stories that exist in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Yeah, Ethan and then Sam.
I've also heard like an idea like our forefathers, so like the people in Genesis were like holding mitzvahs, right? Like there's a story of like Abraham, like.
Right, so there is an idea that a lot of that the Talmud tells us that the patriarchs and matriarchs all kept the entire Torah, right, even though they hadn't been given the actual Torah, right, which is a much deeper idea, and we'll hopefully get to that eventually. Okay, possible, yeah. Sam?
Could you repeat the initial question?
The initial question is, Rashi asks the question, why does the Torah start from in the beginning? It should really start from the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. And Rashi seems to be making an assumption, which is that the Torah exists solely for the purpose of teaching us the mitzvahs. So where did he get that from? Yeah, okay, let's go with Cole.
Kind of the answer to Rashi, but also why it starts here is in order to receive the mitzvot, we must first accept that there is a God and there was a creator. As the creator was the one who gave us the mitzvot. So it's kind of like this linear path where you have to accept to receive and then to accept.
So you're answering a different question, which is, what is all this doing here, right? We're simply asking the question, where does Rashi's question even begin? Why is he suggesting that the Torah should begin from the mitzvahs? And you're offering an answer which is, even if the Torah is about mitzvahs, we need all the stories here to get to the mitzvahs. Now, I like your answer, but it's not the same answer that Rashi gives. Rashi should have said, we need the story of creation to teach us that there's a God, and since there's a God, we should follow his commandments. It's not what he says. He says we need the story of creation to teach us that he created the world and he can give us the land of Israel. So we'll get to that. All right, let's just take Lewis, and then I want to try to sum up what people have been saying so far. Yeah.
I feel like Rashi might make an assumption because of the word Torah itself means like instructions. It's supposed to be like a set of instructions. Like if it was supposed to be, like the Torah was supposed to be a story, it would be like sipur. Like I don't know, but like Torah is more aligned with the word for instruction.
Very interesting, Lewis. Lewis, you came up with that on your own?
I heard that it was. I knew I didn't come up with the fact that Torah came from the word instructions.
Right.
But I've never heard that specific.
Okay, so one of the great commentaries on Rashi, called the Gur Aryeh, which was written by the Maharal of Prague, which you will hear a lot of that name in the next year, is who lived in the 15th century in Prague. The Maharal says exactly that. He says Rashi's bothered by the fact that the name of the book means instruction. Torah comes from the word hora, which means instruction. This is a book of instruction. This is a book that's teaching me what to do, how to be a human being. And I'll just finesse that a little bit more. There's a big debate that went on in the Talmud about what's more important, study or deed. Should we all be sitting in yeshiva, or should we all be out on the front lines as activists to save the planet or save the whales or whatever it is that you choose? And their answer is, well, study is greater because it leads you to greater deeds. Now, at the end of the day, as human beings, we are to understand ourselves as somehow a composite of a body and a soul. Right? And we'll get into that a little bit when we get to the second chapter here, hopefully, is that there is a part of us that is non-physical, that is beyond, transcends this material universe, and there's a part of us that's very much physical. Now, which one's more important? So you come to yeshiva and you think, oh, this is the rabbi, I'm going to give him the holy answer. We're all the soul. The soul is the most important part of a human being. We've all got to identify with our souls. And my response to you is, that is 100% wrong. The reason why we're here is not to be a soul. You know what? It's really nice to be a soul, because your soul is absolutely fine. Whatever that thing that is called soul is perfect. It's fine. It doesn't need fixing. It doesn't need help. It doesn't need a journey or a process. It's absolutely pure and beautiful and amazing. So there's only one reason why we're here, and that's because this physical universe needs a lot of work. Our bodies are heavy and inertial and likes white refined sugar and prefers to lay down on the couch and watch television rather than do incredible acts of kindness and things that change the world. So I'm here not to just live in the day spa of my soul. I'm here to identify the soul and to connect with it in order to elevate everything else. The reason why we need this Torah is not because we're souls, it's because we have bodies. And the body needs a lot of instruction. The reason why we have a Torah, the reason why Rashi is bothered and says we should be starting straight from the mitzvahs is because I'm not interested in a philosophy book. I'm not interested in a history book. I'm not interested in a book of Kabbalah. I'm not interested in any of that stuff unless it serves one purpose. And that is, how do I affect my actions and my behavior down here on earth? That's why mitzvahs are the most important part of the Torah. So Rashi asked the question. Let's start from the Torah. And now, mind you, we still need these stories. We still need the creation story. We need to know that God created the universe. We need to know that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived, and there's so many things we can learn from them. But some commentaries say what Rashi's his real question is, why don't we put this later in the book? Or why don't we stick this with all the other accumulated wisdom that we have in the oral Torah? The parts of the book that help flesh out the things that need teachers, the things that need greater understanding. You think you and I can understand the 6 days of creation? We're going to read this and we're going to have no idea what it's talking about. This stuff is deep, deep, deep that even the greatest Jewish sages didn't really fully understand. So what's it doing here at the beginning of the book? So Rashi says it has to be serving a very tangible purpose. That's why Rashi's assumption is that the Torah should start from mitzvahs. Okay, any questions on that answer so far, Sam?
I'm like trying to form an answer in my head, but is the Torah chronological, like in its sequence of events?
Yeah, more or less.
More or less.
There is a concept which the Talmud invokes, which is that just because it's written in a particular order does not necessarily mean that everything in the Torah is chronological, and we'll see that. We'll see that. Yeah.
Okay.
Roy?
I wanted to add something about what you said right now.
Yeah.
I'm not like fake. This isn't something I thought of. It's something that Rabbi Akiva Tat said. He said the reason the Torah doesn't start with mitzvahs is because there's something that comes before mitzvahs and also commandments. He said he brought the example of somebody who's sick in a hospital and there's a commandment to go visit the sick. So he says if you're going to visit a sick person strictly because it's a commandment, then you're missing the point because the commandment is meant to evoke a kindness.
Yes.
So there's you have to be, before you start with the mitzvahs, you have to be a natural person with.
Great, absolutely. And there is no doubt, there is another famous medrash that says that before we can receive the Torah, and before we can receive the mitzvahs, we have to know simply what it means to be a good human being. Yeah?
Isn't that the opposite of we will do and then we'll understand?
No. I'm not sure it is. Why do you think it's the opposite of we will do and we will understand?
Because I think what you guys are saying is we need to understand first and then we can do the mitzvah.
I think what it means, I think what Roy is suggesting, is that a person has to achieve a certain level of baseline functioning in society before they can take upon themselves mitzvahs which are beyond just being a good person. A mitzvah is not just a good deed, as I think a lot of us have grown up thinking that that's how it's translated. A mitzvah is an unbelievably sacred act that connects me to the source of the universe and sends shockwaves throughout all of reality. So before I can do that, I just need to make sure that I'm like a nice guy. Rabbi Gershenfeld, who I'm not sure you have yet had the privilege of meeting, but we'll be able to meet soon, told a very interesting story. He said many years ago, there was a guy who came on a Ma'or trip. Anybody here went on a Ma'or trip? Right? So Ma'or is the organization that is affiliated with Machon Yaakov in the United States. It's on university campuses. And this guy was loving the learning. He was loving the yeshiva environment. He said, Rabbi, I want to come to yeshiva. And Rabbi Gershenfeld said, I'm sorry, I can't accept you because you are an alcoholic. And until you sort out your drinking problem, yeshiva is not going to help you. So this guy needed to learn simply how to be a self-sufficient, healthy human being to begin with before he could start doing mitzvahs. Yeah? And by the way, that guy went back home, he went to rehab, and he didn't end up coming to yeshiva. And I asked Rabbi Gershenfeld later, do you regret rejecting him? And he said, not for a second. Not for a second. We need to be healthy human beings before we can. Now, that's a beautiful answer for why we need all of these stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to see what it means to be an incredible human being before we can accept the Torah. But that's not Rashi's answer. So now let's get to step 2. Let's get to the second question that we had, which is, what does this have to do with mitzvahs? Granted, it's a book of mitzvahs. Great. What does the land of Israel have to do with mitzvahs? Why is it so important that we know that we have a rightful claim to this land before we can start getting into mitzvahs, if that's what this is all about? Aaron?
I mean, first off, I think some mitzvahs are only applicable in
Okay.
So that's like,
Fantastic. First answer is, there's a lot of mitzvahs that are dependent upon living in the land of Israel. Can someone give me an example? Shemitah. What's Shemitah?
Harvest every 7 years.
Every 7th year, you have to let the land lie fallow. You're not allowed to work the land. You're not allowed to water your crops. You're not allowed to mass harvest your land. The land becomes ownerless. It's amazing. When you're here on a Shemitah year, you can go out to any of the farms that observe Shemitah today in the land of Israel, of which there are many. You can walk into an orchard and pick a whole barrel of apples. Just walk in and grab it. The best part is, as you're soon going to see, when Sukkot rolls around. Now, an esrog, which is a citron, is one of the 4 species that you need to grab and shake around on Sukkot. It's not so cheap. These are pretty expensive, these little lemons. Yeah, I had a friend who was he was in New York City and he was selling etrogs in Midtown Manhattan on 47th Street by the Diamond District, where all the Jews work. And he had a whole table full of citrons, full of esrogs. And this woman walks up, who's clearly not Jewish, and she's like, "What you selling here?" And he's like, "Well, these are citrons, ma'am." And she's like, "Ah, citron, huh? How much is that one?" And he says, "Well, that one, ma'am, is $50. $50 for a citron? What are you, crazy?" So we Jews are a little bit crazy. But on a Shemitah year, you can walk into an esrog farm, an esrog orchard, and pick 5 of them off the tree and pick the best one. Amazing. Amazing. So one of them is Shemitah. Anything else? What else?
Sell the rest 5.
What?
Sell the rest 4.
Yeah, well, you can't sell them. You're not allowed to sell them. What? Yibum is not dependent upon the land of Israel. What? Bikurim, the first fruits. When you see your fruits blossoming, you put a ribbon around the first one, right? Around the first, it's really the first piece of barley or whatever it is, but you take that up to Jerusalem and you offer it to the temple, and for that matter, all of the laws that pertain to the temple, of which there are many, the sacrifices and the laws of the Kohen and the laws of the Levi. Any Kohanim here? Kohen? Levi? Anyone a Levi? No one? Okay.
Didn't we do carve-out all the way to Israel as well?
So those were, there were sacrifices that were allowed to be offered before the entrance to the land of Israel, but once you got to Israel, you cannot offer it anywhere else. You can't do it anywhere else. Right, exactly. So now, today, all the laws of korbanot, of sacrifices, are dependent. We can't do them outside. If you start, sacrificing a goat in New Jersey, not only I think is it illegal, but you're going to get a lot of funny stares. Yeah. What else?
No, it's Josh.
Okay. Remind me your name.
Brandon.
Brandon. Yeah. You were over here yesterday. Brandon. Okay. What else? Any other mitzvahs that are dependent upon? There's. How about all of the tithing mitzvahs, right? So if you are a farmer, you have to take 1/10 of your crop and give it to the Levi, and another piece of your crop and give it to the Kohen, because the Leviim were not allowed to own land.
Are the laws of war, are those only about Israel?
There are, yes, the laws of war are also applicable only to Israel. That's right. That's right.
I forget. There's a holiday that is only observed one day, and
most holidays are observed for only one day in Israel, whereas there are 2, except for Rosh Hashanah, which is why.
General days, or?
It's just for Rosh Hashanah. Very, very quickly. Does anyone have just a watch that I can just borrow here? Because we are quickly going to run out of time. But I'm loving this, so if you guys are happy to just go on tangents. So the reason why the holidays are kept for 2 days outside of Israel is because the way that information used to be conveyed was through word of mouth. Now, like we said yesterday, every holiday is contingent upon when the new moon is, when you spot the new moon. So somebody in Israel would see the new moon, run to Jerusalem, testify at the court that that is the first day of the month. And then from there, they would set their calendar and they say, okay, if this is the month of Nisan, then 15 days later, we're going to have Pesach. We're going to have Passover, right? Now, the far-flung communities outside of Israel didn't always get that information so quickly. And as a result, in order to make sure that they were keeping everything, they would add a second day out of doubt to make sure that they were keeping the day of Pesach or the day of Sukkot or the day of whatever, right? Now, in Israel, you didn't need that extra day because everything was local. If you knew something was the new moon, then for sure 15 days later, you would know when was Pesach and when was Sukkot and all of those other holidays. However, there's one holiday that falls out on the first day of the month. What holiday is that? Rosh Hashanah. And so it wasn't guaranteed that everybody, even in Israel, would hear that when Rosh Hashanah was going to be. And as a result, they keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah out of doubt here as well. Okay, I want to keep going, okay? So now, one answer is we have a lot of mitzvahs that depend upon the land of Israel. But that's kind of a side reason. In other words, yeah, okay, for a lot of mitzvahs, we need to know that we have the rightful claim to the land of Israel. But is that the reason why we need to preface all of the mitzvahs with our claim to the land of Israel? Is it, to me, that's like a nice answer, but it's not the strongest answer. You get what I'm saying? I want to know, is there some central, fundamental, foundational aspect of the land of Israel and our rightful claim to it that is the introduction to all of the mitzvahs? Ethan.
I think without Hashem, well, that's actually, I'll leave anyway. Like the Jews, without Hashem's help, probably would have never claimed the land of Israel.
Okay.
And so it's it's a show of power. It's a show of his greatness. How he took some a small people and made them bountiful.
True, fantastic. That's true. But what does that have to do with mitzvahs? Brandon?
I would say it's part of our identity, the land of Israel, and doing mitzvahs and following the Torah. Take what is part of our essence.
Okay. I think there's something really to appreciate here, which is that we live in a world where people are so free-flowing and are so unrooted to the places where they come from that we don't fully appreciate the power and the importance of space in our world. How many people, you ask them where they're from and they're like, well, I'm a citizen of the world, right? You've seen those t-shirts? And it's a very nice thing to say, well, I'm global-minded and I'm part of the global community. But in reality, human beings are very specific people and rooted in very specific things. I think we don't always appreciate how much we are defined by the place that we grew up. If you've ever spent a lot of time in another culture and another community, man, it was such a culture shock for me when I first moved to London. Because as Winston Churchill once said, we are two nations divided by a common language. So you think that you're the same because you speak the same language, but you start talking to people and the way that they think is totally different. I went up to one guy, when I first moved in, I lived in a community of people who were more traditional, but not particularly very, very observant. And I asked one young guy in synagogue one week, I said, why do you come? I said, why do you come to synagogue? Because I knew he wasn't, he openly told me that he wasn't that religious, but he still liked coming to shul. And he said, you know what I like? I like the fact that I'm doing exactly what my grandfather was doing 60, 70 years ago, and I'm keeping up that tradition. And I said, that is such an un-American answer. Americans don't want to have anything to do with tradition. We were born out of rebelling against tradition. We want something that is unique and individual, and I'm a self-made man, and I create my own traditions. Forget what my grandfather did. British people love tradition. British people love keep calm and carry on. And for them, it's the most natural thing in the world to say, I like connecting with my past. But for an American, it's anathema to who we are. So you see, our culture and who we are is very much defined by where we come from. There's something very amazing about the fact that we as Jews care so much about the land of Israel. I'll tell you another interesting story. I know we're never going to get anywhere, but hey, what the heck. There was a guy named David Zeller who was a very interesting character. He grew up in the 60s in San Francisco. I think, did this like stop working?
Yeah, right, got hot.
Yeah, I don't know. Well,
It's perfect. No.
okay. There was a guy who grew up in the 60s in San Francisco, David Zeller, and his parents were Jungian psychotherapists, so he was very much involved in the hippie movement, and ended up going to a kibbutz for a short time in Israel, but really was swayed by the kind of Indian gurus, and he spent some time in India. Now, eventually, he found his way back to Judaism, and many years later, because he had had that experience with Indian philosophy and religion, he was contacted when a certain individual named Ram Dass wanted to visit the land of Israel. Does anyone know who Ram Dass is?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So when I was 21 years old, if you were to visit me as a 21-year-old at the University of Pennsylvania, you basically see a big hippie, right? So I loved, Buddhist meditation, and my hair was long, and what? I didn't wear a peace necklace. Didn't go that far, but one of my favorite books was a book called "Be Here Now" by Ram Dass, which was this. It was almost like kind of like the Bible for New Age spirituality in the 70s. And Ram Dass was this very well-known speaker. He was an American. Actually, he was a Harvard professor of psychology who, along with his colleague Timothy Leary, started experimenting with LSD in the 1960s and got kicked out because they were, basically performing psychological experiments with their students with LSD. At Harvard. At Harvard. He ended up going to India, found a guru, and became this great spokesperson in America for Indian philosophy. In any case, he was born Jewish. His name was Richard Alpert. And he felt like it was part of his karmic responsibility to go visit the land of Israel because he was born Jewish. And so David Zeller was the one who guided him around. And as he took him around the land of Israel and was showing him the importance and significance of the land, Ram Dass had one question, which is, why do you guys care about this land? Like, if God is everywhere, we're supposed to be non-attached to the physical world. I don't understand why you care so much about this piece of dirt. And David Zeller basically said, that's the difference between you and me, is that you're trying to transcend this world, and I'm trying to elevate this world. And if I don't come from somewhere, I cannot do that. The Jewish people are like a game of Clue. You have Colonel Mustard with the lead pipe in the study. If you don't have the Jews with the Torah and mitzvahs in the land of Israel, then you're missing one of the cornerstones of what it means to be a Jew. So yes, we really do need to know about what it means to have a claim to the land of Israel, because all of our Jewish identity, including the mitzvah performance, is built on that. Okay. So, that's one of the answers, why it is so important to start with the land of Israel before we get into the mitzvahs. Yeah?
But obviously, Rashi was writing this in exile. He was in...
That's right.
He was in France or whatever.
Sure.
Jews couldn't even go to Israel at the time, I don't think. So, yeah.
Because every Jew for 2,000 years has been longing to come back here. And the Jews who didn't, and the Jews who weren't, they're no longer around. Part of what keeps us as a people is the fact that we're so rooted to this place. Yeah?
Something that I actually seen here is also a message to the world. Okay, it says here in this argumentation of Rashi that so that the people, that all the peoples of the world would acknowledge, okay, God gave this land to us.
Yeah.
And I immediately thought of this prophecy that one day on Sukkot every year, all the nations will actually come to Jerusalem, so that there's also something that it's not just for us, but it's also dedicated for the entire world to acknowledge God.
Okay, so let's get into that, because our third question was going to be, is anybody going to buy this, right? Anybody outside of the Jewish people going to buy this? So just one more idea here, just to touch on this, is that we're going to see throughout the entire book of the Torah, and the first book of the Torah is, space has a lot of importance. People are constantly placed somewhere and driven out, and placed somewhere and driven out. And space and where we live and our access and our right to that space is very much dependent upon who we are and whether we're worthy to inhabit that space. Whether it's Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden, whether it's the generation of the Tower of Babel who are dispersed throughout the earth, Abraham coming into the land, leaving the land, coming back in, the Jewish people coming down to Egypt. So much of the story of humanity is about whether or not we're entitled to our place. And the other thing that's important to know is that this is teaching us that there is a rhythm and a rhyme to all of this movement of human history. This isn't random. Whether somebody lives somewhere, is driven out somewhere, gets access to somewhere, is not just up to the roll of the dice. There is a purpose to all of this. There is a providence to it. And we have to see that hidden hand. And that's what really this Rashi is telling us, is that God, there is a force. It's hard to use the word God because it's a very loaded term. But there are forces of the universe that are acting in such a way such that if we are meant to be here and we are here, then it's for a reason. So that's also very much an important introduction to how we see our mitzvahs, is that our good deeds are the litmus test, are the impetus for how we live and how we are treated in this world. If we have fortune or misfortune, it has everything to do with the way that we behave and the mitzvahs that we perform or don't. Yes, Joey.
I'd like to challenge the one.
Go ahead.
That we had, for why we said that Israel, the mitzvot, and the Jews are the three cornerstones of Judaism, go hand in hand. So that makes sense, and I understand that, but it still doesn't really answer why Israel had to come first before the mitzvot. Why did we have to start here and not necessarily where the first commandment was? Because you could have gone through the mitzvot and then brought the stories of Israel afterwards as well. So it still leaves that part of the question.
Yeah.
I think open.
And I think to even strengthen your point is that where did the Jews receive the mitzvahs?
Egypt.
Not Egypt. Not Israel.
Saudi
It's in some desert. Yeah. Maybe that is Egypt. Whatever. It was no man's land back then, right?
Not the.
It was the desert. It was the uninhabited land. So there has to be some element of mitzvahs that are not 100% tied. In other words, I'm allowed to go do mitzvahs in London, right? Although there's a famous saying by Nachmanides, the Ramban, who lived in the 14th century, that one who lives outside of the land of Israel is as if they have no God, and it's as if they're not even doing mitzvahs. But we don't really. I think he was saying that as more of a hyperbole, as an exaggeration. But in any case, look,
Where was that said?
What?
Where was that said?
Nachmanides in his commentary on the Torah. For him, you can't even speak of mitzvahs until you get to the land of Israel. In a certain sense, it's almost like you're pretending until you live. Nachmanides, he lived in Spain until he was driven out. He did at some point make it to Israel, but like I'd said, just because we don't appreciate the fact that, first of all, travel was almost impossible before a couple hundred years ago, and travel to Israel was forbidden. Jews were not allowed here for most of history. So the fact that they didn't live here is not any evidence that they didn't take it seriously. They longed for Israel. And the fact that we're all sitting here is a privilege. Now, it's a very fair point, and I think there's more to speak about in that question. There are also other answers. A very beautiful answer given by one of the sages is, it may be not necessarily just the land of Israel, but simply the fact that we're establishing that the foundation of all of morality is ownership. What did Rashi say? Those who claim that we don't have a right to the land, we'll tell them God created the world and therefore he owns it. As a result of God's ownership, that might be the entire reason why we're obligated in keeping the mitzvahs. We're in God's house, man. You got to follow the rules. So it's possible to say that the foundation of all the mitzvahs is simply the principle of God's ownership over the whole world, and of which the right to Israel is one example. So there are lots of answers that we could go with. I just don't want to overwhelm you guys with all the different answers. So there's some really beautiful creative answers that are going on here. Yes, Sam?
Yeah, so I guess going back to why Rashi would say this. Like when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, why would Rashi even bring this up? Because obviously the way the Torah is written is correct, and it's been correct for the entire time. So he's trying to get us to think, like he's trying to like jog our minds.
Good.
And I don't remember, like I was taught this and I forget what rabbi said it, but the point of creation was giving, right? Like that's like the ultimate mitzvah. So when they say in the beginning God's creating the earth, like isn't that a mitzvah in and of itself? And then Israel's tangential because we were given the land later. So that like it's starting with the first and probably the most ultimate and greatest mitzvah because
of giving that God created by giving.
Yeah, and all mitzvahs are to imbue our physicality with something that's not physical and transcends.
Yeah, well, there is no question that certainly in strands of Jewish philosophy, it's when people try to ask maybe the ultimate question, which is why did God create the universe? One of the answers given is because God, as a perfect being, has a desire to give, right? Being a giver, being kind, is certainly an attribute you would look for in somebody who's a developed human being. So all the more so God, right? There's only one problem. If you're God, then there ain't nobody else. So God had to, so to speak, create a recipient that's capable of receiving his good, right? There's a lot more to say about that, but that's a beautiful idea. But let's just come back to the Rashi in the last 5 minutes. We had one last question, which is, who's gonna believe this? There's no way we can take this book onto Columbia campus and start telling people that we actually have a legitimate claim to the land of Israel. So, what's the answer? Azrael, what do you say? And then Ethan.
It's not the answer to them directly, but it's in order to answer the doubt that inside of us on their questions.
Beautiful. So a mid-20th century rabbi answered that question with that answer. And he said, and this yet again speaks to another understanding of why we need this before the mitzvahs, which is, this is not to answer non-Jews. This is to settle our own doubts, because people are going to come to us all the time, if you haven't noticed, and tell us that we are thieves and we're crooked. And if you look up in the dictionary of slang, to Jew somebody means to cheat them out of their money. That's not an accident. What it means to be a Jew to the rest of the world means to be dishonest. And we need to know that what we're doing is right and clear and good. And before we can start keeping any of these commandments, we need to know that we're not on the wrong side of history here. That what we're doing is moral and right. We need to believe in our own system before we can start keeping any of the mitzvahs. Yeah, Ben.
But that's not what Rashi says, right?
Right.
He says it's for other people.
That's right. Well, let's read it, right? Rashi says that if the non-Jews come and tell you, right, that they stole, that you are thieves and that you conquered the lands of the other land, they'll say to them, right? So Ben pointing out something interesting, which is that I'll say to you. Now there's two reasons why you can answer somebody. It's either to give them an answer or to give yourself an answer. Anybody here read a Passover Haggadah before? Right, so you got 4 sons. So what do we say to the wicked son? No, the wicked son, right? The wicked son, what does it says? What are all these commandments to you, right? So it says you blunt his teeth and you say it's because of what God did for me and not for you, you know. And essentially, the commentaries say that you're not really answering the wicked son, because the wicked son is not asking a real question. He doesn't want to know the answer. You're answering to the other people in the room. So it's possible that we can still be responding to ourselves and not just the non-Jews. However, Ben's point is a good point. So maybe it's possible that we are speaking to non-Jews. What do you have to say?
I think they really do know this actually, and if they don't, like, there might be a veil in front of them now, because like and correct me if I'm wrong, but our tradition teaches that like all nations will realize like the word of like Hashem and like that the Jews are His chosen people. So like we're answering them, and like they will know this eventually. So we're not like they will accept this answer, and it's just
Okay.
not
So
apparent to them yet.
this is where we start to do an interesting dance. Is the Torah a universalist document or a particularist one? Is it just for us or is it for everybody?
Sure. Both.
It's kind of both.
It's both.
How is it both? Yeah.
Well, you have the Noahide laws that are in the Torah, and
Okay.
the whole story of creation, which obviously applies to everybody, and
Okay.
everybody's descended like
Yeah, maybe.
from Noah and Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
But then once it gets into the specific mitzvot and the story of the once it gets to Yaakov and beyond, it's pretty much our story.
Okay. What do you guys say? Is it our book? Or is it everyone's book?
So it's our book. The Torah was given in Israel by Israel. However, everyone else has access to it, even so they rejected it, they still have access.
Yeah.
So it's like for them.
So, if anybody here has read any Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he talks about this a lot.
Yeah.
Which is that we are a particularist religion in the sense that we're not out to make everybody Jewish, right? We are given a set of commandments which are for us. However, our message is universal. We are here to spread something called monotheism to the world. And monotheism, other than the fact that it's just a theology, it's not just, what do you believe in particular? Monotheism suggests that there is a unified source to all of reality. And that means that if I look at every other human being on the planet, I look at them and they say, you are cut from the same cloth as me. We are all part of the same mosaic and the same story. And there's no way that I could achieve what I need to achieve without you. And in that sense, we are meant to spread the values and the ideas of monotheism to the rest of the world. And it's entirely possible that one day the world will look at this and say, yeah, hey man, you're right. Look, already in some form or another, the majority of the world already agrees that the Hebrew God exists. Now they may disagree with some of the finer points. The Muslims say that we have a corrupted version of the text. The Christians certainly take our Bible and run with it, take it even further than we did. But in any case, it's not so far off to believe that this document is meant for everybody. Now the mitzvahs are for us, but maybe Rashi is saying that what we have to start off with, before we get into particulars, is we have to start by saying, let's be world conscious. Let's understand that this is meant for everybody. And the very fact, I think this is what is most amazing about this Rashi, the very fact that Rashi says that we should know what to answer to non-Jews. We could just say, get out of my face. I don't need to justify anything to you. But we don't say that. We say, look, let's engage you in conversation. I want you to believe that I'm an honest and straightforward human being and that the Jewish people are good people. Well, that's an incredible display of confidence in the rest of humanity, don't you think? That it's worth us having an answer to other people. I think that's something that we have to keep at the forefront of our minds as Jewish people, is that right now, for this year, you guys are here to build yourselves, to learn, as many of you said yesterday, to understand what it means to be a Jew. But in 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or whenever it is that you feel like you have developed a solid base of what it means to be Daniel and Ethan and Miles and Lewis, eventually you're going to have to start looking outwards and saying, okay, I'm a Jew, so what can I do for the rest of the world? It's a pretty good first Rashi, don't you guys think? All right.